Tonight on Nation to Nation, the federal government announced billions in new funding to combat homelessness. That includes for Indigenous people. But there is one problem.
You don't know how much is going to go to Indigenous communities. You don't know how much is going to be spent.
Ottawa also plans to enshrine Gladue principles into law. The hope is to lower incarceration rates of Indigenous people. But one expert says the principles need to be used correctly.
They need to be involved when their first entry into the justice system.
I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. The federal government wants to tackle the homelessness problem. Earlier this week, Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, Jean-Yves Duclos, announced $2.2 billion in funding over the next 10 years. $1.25 billion of it will go to designated communities. How much of that will target Aboriginal people is not known right now. However, Duclos said Indigenous agencies would get a significant amount, and that would transform Ottawa's relationship with Indigenous people on the issue of homelessness. To discuss this more is our panel of MPs. Joining me now is the Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller. Welcome. Conservative Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Cathy McLeod, and NDP MP Nikki Ashton. Welcome. Now, Mr. Miller, I'll start with you. When will we know how much we're talking about for Indigenous agencies?
Well, look, first let me acknowledge Indigenous Veterans Day, which is today, and that means acknowledging the 12,000 veterans that served in the Canadian Armed Forces to protect us and so that we could live in peace. And I want to take that moment, I think I speak on behalf of the three of us, to acknowledge that unfortunately they haven't been well served by it in a number of circumstances, and that includes instances of homelessness that we see today. The recent announcement doubles existing funding as regards Indigenous communities. One of the first initiatives this government took was to invest heavily into Indigenous communities. The precondition of that is working in partnership. So if there's a lack of clarity, it is simply because we need to do proper assessments to ensure that the money is going where it's supposed to, and that we work in partnership with the people that know their needs best, which is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit.
Now, Minister Duclos said it was a transformative relationship. Isn't this more rhetoric, that perhaps a promise that can't be kept before the next election?
Well, the promise is to work with communities to ensure that the needs and resources are identified and money deployed, current amounts are deployed, and there are transformative changes happening in communities. Are they happening at the pace that people would like it to happen? You'll find people that don't think it's going fast enough, and that's clear. We've made an undertaking to reduce homelessness by 50% with the amounts that we've invested. We're quite proud of that. In my mind, that is quite transformative.
Ms. McLeod, conservative reaction to this multi-billion-dollar announcement?
So first of all, homelessness is an important issue. It's a key issue throughout the country, and certainly housing in terms of Indigenous communities absolutely critical. What I am again concerned about is, the government is really good at what I call the razzle-dazzle, the announcements, the words about transformative change. When you dig into the details of their announcements, they're typically dated past the next election date. So there's, what they do is they raise hopes and expectations, and then what people are saying is, on the ground, we're not seeing anything. We're not seeing a difference. So, I hope this is not another announcement the same as all the others. I have to look at the details because, as you say, you don't know how much is going to go to Indigenous communities. You don't know how much is going to be spent. And then when you put it over 10 years, sometimes it works out to be very, very few housing units. So, ultimately, of course, the solution is prosperous communities, and prosperous communities benefiting from the resources in their communities and having the capacity to make these decisions for themselves.
Ms. Ashton, from an NDP perspective, sounds like a good news announcement. Will this, in hand with the housing and funding that Ms. McLeod alluded to over the past two budgets, will this get rid of the housing crisis, especially in your riding in northern Manitoba?
Well, first off, I'll say one of the biggest issues, in fact, when I go door to door visiting in communities, housing is the #1 issue that's brought up. We're talking about communities with waiting lists of 700 to 800 people. We're talking about homes that are mold infested with 17, 18, upward of 20 people living in them. We're talking about third world living conditions. So when I hear about an announcement that uses all the right words, but is not clear on how much is going to Indigenous communities, and certainly wasn't rolled out 3 years ago when the Liberals took power, I know that I'm certainly not pleased, and neither are people at home. Look, folks on the ground are not seeing housing being built in their communities, and if it is, it's certainly nowhere near the amount that's necessary. And I've also, I work with several communities that have really exciting proposals. So this talk of new relationships, I mean, great, but people have made proposals, have sought out funding, and have been rejected. The department hasn't worked with them. The minister hasn't taken the time to really hear from them. And so the solutions for many are there. The potential is there. And unfortunately, the government hasn't acted. So when I hear this announcement, I am pretty cynical, and increasingly so are people on the ground.
Now, I know it's not your minister, Mr. Miller, but the Indigenous Services did just announce a 6-unit housing project on the Beausoleil First Nation, but it costs $1.1 million for 6 units. I mean, how many homes can really be built despite what has come into what funding has come into the last 2 budgets?
Look, there are specific needs in communities that will vary, and price will vary accordingly. We have issues of remoteness, you have issues of heating, insulation, and depending on the community, the needs and the per unit price may be different. Cost is always an issue, clearly, but it isn't the primary issue. The primary issue is ensuring that people have a roof over their heads and that they can thrive in their communities. Miss Ashton is a good spokesman for her people, and she will note that there are housing projects across Canada that are taking place. Perhaps not at the pace that she would like it, but clearly this is something we've invested in, and we do see these projects developing with housing that'll keep people safe for decades.
Ms. Ashton, of course, as mentioned earlier, you do come from a rural riding. Is $1.1 million for 6 units, is that an efficient way to be producing new housing?
Well, we're clearly not working with the reality of communities. I represent a number of Winter Road only accessible communities, up north, and it's I mean, the figure of 300,000 plus to build one home with the bare minimum is sort of what you hear of. But like I said, I mean, there's communities that have really exciting proposals. There's communities that have done some work. In fact, there's some work right now on building, small homes, and and where is the federal government? It's not there, and we've seen sort of a couple of houses here, a couple of houses there, but the work is not being done to address the need. It's not being done to address the renovation needs either, and so at the end of the day, the government talk of reconciliation, the talk of working with communities, when it comes to one of the biggest issues of, frankly, a crisis, the housing crisis, we're not actually seeing the words follow up with the action.
Ms. McLeod, last word on this topic. How would the Conservatives, get the best bang for the buck?
So I always remember being in the Atlantic and meeting with the First Nations community there who had taken advantage of the economic opportunities. And I remember the chief telling me, he says, every single band member, when they become of age, are given $30,000 to build their own house. They can build it in our community, or they can build it in, have it for the city. So, the government needs to, I have to go back to the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is economic prosperity for communities, enjoying the benefits of the natural resources, and being able to make their own decisions about how to spend their own money, instead of having to wait for the federal government, who, if you look at the history through many, many governments, has not met the needs. Communities need to meet their needs.
Okay, thank you for this topic. When we come back, have we reached a turning point in the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in federal prisons? Welcome back. It's well established that Indigenous people make up a larger number of inmates, one that's out of proportion to their population. Last week, correctional investigator Ivan Zinger released his annual report, and things continue to get worse. In 1 year, the percentage of Indigenous people who make up the prison population has jumped from under 27% to 29%. Not only the numbers, but being denied parole more often, heavier sentencing, and no access to culturally significant programs while behind bars. Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodall has promised to improve some of these with Bill C-83. It will, among other things, enshrine the Gladue principle in law. Here's a bit of what he said earlier this week.
But now it will be actually enshrined in law that Indigenous histories and backgrounds and characteristics need to be taken into account in the custodial and transfer and treatment decisions made by the Correctional Service of Canada.
Ms. McLeod, I'll start with you in the second round. Bill C-83 doesn't necessarily keep Indigenous people out of prison, but it promises, I suppose, to not have them re-offend as much. But how does this jibe with a Conservative push to get tougher on crime?
First of all, I want to go to the Healing Lodge issue, and certainly Healing Lodges, I think, can play an absolutely critical role. I was really glad to hear yesterday that the government backtracked on the McClintock thing, because you know, when you're taking up capacity in healing lodges with people that are clearly inappropriate, what you're doing is denying other people the opportunity to have the exposure to culture and customs. So I think, you know, that is certainly one thing that I think is, we see an important role for healing lodges. But I think what we really, really need to do is, again, I'm going to talk to backtracking. Until you get to the roots of these issues, I think we're going to continue to have challenges. So, you know, the roots of the issues are, as we all know, it's education, it's opportunity, it's hope. So that really, I would, you know, as a Conservative, really think we need to focus a lot of our energy and effort in terms of those upstream opportunities.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of healing lodges, but I know there was a lot of rhetoric, especially last month, about their country clubs, their condos, coming from the Conservatives. Didn't this hurt the image of healing lodges in the Canadian public's mind, though?
I would say what we were suggesting was that it was an entirely inappropriate place for a murderer of an 8-year-old girl so early in her sentence. I think the issue is it's an appropriate place for people who are needing to reconnect with their culture and to get themselves ready to be back into the communities.
Ms. Ashton, has, from your perspective, healing lodges taken a hit in the Canadian public's mind over this whole McClintock issue?
Well, the NDP was really disappointed to see political games be played with, you know, obviously a really tragic situation. You know, what we've said from the beginning is you know, we need a justice system where rehabilitation, where healing is critical. But I will say, to the point of the investigator, you know, these findings are devastating. I mean, 40% of women inmates are Indigenous women, you know, and as you pointed out, the trends are getting worse. And unfortunately, these aren't new things that the investigator has said. I mean, look, we're talking about a system that is frankly profiting off of incarcerating Indigenous people. You know, it's rife with, you know, in all steps of the way, systemic racism, and we need to counter this. Like, these numbers are unacceptable. In fact, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission compelled us to make a difference on this front, and I will say, you know, we do need to work on prevention, but we certainly, I mean, when we're hearing that people are in the system and don't have opportunities to heal, for support, you know, we're talking about a revolving door, and you know, we have a responsibility to work with Indigenous peoples to put a stop to these numbers.
Mr. Miller, I'll get you a chance to respond to what you heard. But what struck me, certainly from Mr. Zinger's report and from his press conference, which I attended, is this trend has been going on for 30 years, and it transcends whichever government is in power. So how can, I suppose, a Liberal government reverse the trend?
Well, certainly in this country we have a problem with systemic racism that we need to address at a broad scale, and the incarceration system is a particularly crying example of the impact that systemic racism has on Indigenous peoples. With 4% of the population, you're looking at the federal rate of 25% incarceration, and then you look at provincial rates,
which is actually 29% now as the latest figure.
And then you look at certain provinces like Saskatchewan, and it's jaw-dropping. Clearly, the answer is not to lock people up and throw away the key, which seems to be the systemic Conservative approach, including the creeping conversation into preconceptions about Indigenous peoples that I keep hearing, and I resist strongly at every occasion. We need an approach that's flexible. This was part of why we introduced C-75 to give flexibility to both prosecutors and police to make decisions. You know, I've spoken to women who have had their babies taken away from them because they have that note on their file. They've been arrested or put into prison for you know, petty crimes, but that note goes on the file. The baby gets taken away, and you wind up on an aggregate scale in what looks like another 60 scoop. We can't turn a blind eye to that, and as a government, when we shine a light on it, we absolutely need to take responsibility for what's going on in this country, and we need to have a dialogue, not just among Indigenous peoples, but as a country as a whole. Non-Indigenous people need to understand that this is a problem, and if we're going to keep identifying ourselves as a country that values our Indigenous peoples, we need to start respecting them, and it starts with taking a cold, hard look at the incarceration system. I think the Bushi trial, for all of us, was another reminder of what needs to be done, whether it's jury selection, but also the process that led to what happened on the farm.
Ms. McLeod, how can the Conservatives, I suppose, reverse the trend if they were in power? Would it be legislation for Bill C-83 or something much broader?
So I think what we need to do, I mean, we need to tackle this issue on a number of different levels, but I want to go back to what's important is that people have, you know, hope, they have opportunity, so that they're not heading down the path in terms of the criminal justice system. I think that's the bigger key. And yes, we can, you know, do things related to the criminal justice system that, which I think successive governments, as you say, the problem is not getting better, it's getting worse. So you need to go back to the roots of the issues, and that's where the solutions are going to be.
Ms. Ashton, I'll give you the last word on this topic.
Well, look, it's this is damning information that's come out. I see it day in, day out in our north, where people are in and out of the system. It is related to issues like housing. I remember a guy up in one of the first Northern First Nations saying, you know, I don't have a place to live, so best get back into prison, to have that warm place to live. I mean, it's just totally outrageous what Indigenous people.
But is the best way to throw more and more money at the problem, though?
Well, I mean, I think there's, the issue of prevention requires much more money, whether we're talking about recreation, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about housing. But clearly, once people hit the system, it is a question of resources, but it's also a question of making sure people have access. And right now, what's clear is that federal governments are turning a blind eye, while the number of and frankly encouraging a system that incarcerates more and more Indigenous people, and that has to stop.
Hey, well, I thank you for this discussion this week. Thank you for being on Nation to Nation. We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. As we just heard, the number of Indigenous people in prison continues to go up. The government says it wants to enshrine Gladue principles into law. The Supreme Court has been telling lower courts to apply the principles for nearly 2 decades, but it clearly hasn't been working. And no one knows that better than our next guest. Mark Marcellet Nawagabo has been writing Gladue reports for several years. Thank you for joining us.
Rich, thank you for having me.
Now, most people think of Gladue reports as get-out-of-jail-free cards, but they're not that. What exactly is a Gladue report?
Well, first of all, even just the wording Gladue is based on the Western colonialistic justice system, a platform I call it, in my opinion. And I refer to them as sacred stories. And they're sacred stories because it's an individual's whole life continuum. When you look at the reports themselves, it's a report from when they were really young, right through their whole life continuum, all the intergenerational and systemic traumas, right through to where they are today, and how they became involved in the justice system or, in fact, incarcerated.
They're supposed to provide alternatives to jail, but that's not happening. Why is that so?
It's continuing to fail. And the reason why it's failing is because what I feel is there's limitations on the reports. And when you really look at the report and who's the entitlement to have a report, This is where they're failing, and this is where they have to acknowledge this. And if we're looking at truth and reconciliation and transparency and reconciling, going towards good, let's be truthful. These reports need to be presented in an individual's life, right from when they're young and involved, even as a young offender, or they need to be involved when their first entry into the justice system. You know, right now, the way legal aid has it, they have loss of liberty, 90 days before they're even entitled to having a report. That's not right. Some of these people still live in marginalized third world conditions, displacement, know nothing else but substance abuse, alcoholism, abuse. The reports tell of their sacred story, and it's informative information that is so valuable to the courts to be able to tell, to be able to come up with recommendations of the individual.
Now, another part of this Gladue principle that Gladue talked about was, you know, Indigenous people face harsher sentencing. They're in jail longer than non-Indigenous people for the same crimes. There are no programs and services for them when they're in there so that maybe they don't reoffend. I mean, how do we, I suppose, adopt that part of the Gladue principle?
You know, it's almost like saying the cart before the horse. The programming is failing. I mean, you can see it in the numbers of our people with the overrepresentation. When you look at an individual that's facing a provincial sentence, it's a holding cell. Let's call it a holding cell. I worked in the jail system for many years. It's a holding cell until they're placed somewhere. There is no minimal programming. Some of the Indigenous people will take a sentence past a provincial sentence and go right to federal because the programming is better. That's not right. There should be programming right across the board, whether it's a community-based sentence, provincial sentence, or federal sentence. We're doing more harm than good. And I think that one of the key areas that needs to be focused on are even healing lodges. You have a woman that's facing, an Indigenous woman that's facing incarceration. She's entitled to going to a healing lodge. Ontario has no healing lodge. The closest one for males is in the Quebec region, Wisseskin Healing Lodge. For women, it's out west. That's not right.
If we call it a Gladue report or a Gladue principle, is this a failure across Canada right now?
It is. It is. I don't think we're doing our people good. You know, when you're looking at the justice system itself and they're saying, you know, reduce the recidivism rate, you know, make a person a productive member of society, are we really holding true to that? Are we for our communities? We have to heal, and it's a healing journey that our reports, these particular sacred stories, are about. It's a healing journey for the individual, and for some people, it's a way of life that they need to see and visualize, sometimes in this report that they've never heard about before.
Well, Mr. Marsalai Nawegabo, I want to thank you for talking to me today on Nation to Nation. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's our show for this week. We're back next week with a special show out of Thunder Bay, where our producer, Kenneth Jackson, has new information about a First Nation youth who died in care. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thank you for watching.